In the previous classes, in the first classes, we got a glimpse of the overall ideas into the anthropology, right? Or how the anthropology started as a distinct discipline with the advent of the colonialism in the 17th and the 18th century, right? When the Europeans first started to encounter the cultures which were definitely different from their own culture, which is sometimes used as other cultures. They also named it as exotic cultures, right? So this is the beginning of the anthropology, or how it began as a discipline in general, that we have seen an overview. And there were various approaches that had been developed during this whole phase when the Europeans tried to interpret these cultural differences or the diversity that existed in the cultures, right? We started with the understanding that the early evolutionists tried to understand the diversity by highlighting that these cultures, which seem to be primitive, are at a very early stage of the cultural evolution. While Europeans, on the other hand, have achieved the highest stage of the cultural evolution, which is the stage of civilization that they have reached, right? So they gave a general theory that all the cultures evolve into these three stages, from savagery to barbarism to civilization. Savagery means a life that is found in the forests, a life that is deeply integrated with the forest. That is why the people living in the forest, sometimes the term savage is also used for them, right? Although now it is a very ethnocentric kind of term that is used for them, but in general, it has been used in the past, right? The second term is barbaric, or the barbarism as the second stage in the social evolution. What does the barbarism as a term mean? Okay. Do the nations not fight? People online?
They're engaging in hunting.
Who do hunting? So
Yes,
what
sir.
do the people living in the forest do? Hunting, gathering. What happened? Fighting for cattle. Okay. See, what has happened is, in the ancient Greek and the Roman society, people who were outside their mainstream society were considered as barbaric, because they used to keep on having a kind of very conflicting situation with the mainstream Greek kingdom, right? So anybody outside that who were seen by them as tribals, they were considered as barbaric by them. So this was an intermediate stage, that they have not reached the Greco-Roman civilization stage, but they are somewhere intermediate between the forest and the civilized state, that is barbaric. So they use that analogy to use the idea of social evolution, right? So they divided it into three stages. And later on, various developments have started in the anthropology, with diffusionism, with later functionalism, right? With later cognitive anthropology, with symbolic and interpretive approaches. So there are so many approaches that started. So we just took a glimpse of that in the initial class. Agree? Then in the next class, we started with a understanding of what exactly is anthropology. What exactly is anthropology? And in that, we have studied and started with certain definitions that have been given by famous anthropologists as to what anthropology simply means, or what is the definition according to them. And the whole feature of a definition that you see that has been used in the anthropology or in any other discipline, if you have to define a phenomena, it is the most difficult task, because the definition should be all encompassing, should almost include the various dimensions of the phenomena that is being studied, right? So that is why we take help from different definitions that have been given by different anthropologists, and then we arrive at the general features of the discipline, which is the famous definition that we generally refer to define anthropology. Or
Study of man and his works.
Yes. So Herzgovitz talked about anthropology being the study of man and his works. Man here referring to what? The biological aspect of the man, and how the man became the man that he is today, or how the humans became the humans that they are today, right? While works refer to everything that has been developed by the man on this planet, or the humans on this planet. And that is referred to as culture, because this is something, these ideas and behaviors, they might have started from one point, but they have developed and evolved over a point, and they have accumulated over a point, which is learned by the subsequent generations. And that is why we who are living today do not start from the scratch. That we go to the jungle, start inventing our stone tools, then start inventing fire, then create our own wheel, then build our own houses. We do not start from there. We start from a considerable higher stage related to that. And everything that we are starting from here is the learned behavior that we have. This behavior that we have learned, this has been accumulated. Today, you are starting directly with the digital technology. The kids today are directly starting and communicating using the mobile phones. Right? This is something that is where the communication as an idea has evolved. Earlier, communication could be very, very difficult. And imagine the idea of communication before the advent of language, which is symbolic communication. Agree or not? So we are starting our lives from this base, which is accumulated knowledge in the society. And everything that we do, every behavior that you reflect is basically the idea that you have learned. Sometimes you might want to project it as if it is your free will. It is your own idea. But in general, you are acting on the lines of what is the expectation of the society, because this is what the society has cumulatively learned over a period of time. For example, you find somebody speeding up on his bike on the road, and you are walking on the road. What would your first reaction be? क्या reaction होगा? People online, people offline.
The biker doesn't have any sense of traffic rules.
ये तुमने सोच के बैठ गए. और कोई और एग्रेसिव? तुमने उसको रैशनलाइज कर लिया कि उसकी जल्दी होगी उसको, ठीक है. और किसी का मन करेगा उसको पीटने का. Somebody wants to beat him up. That is this guy an idiot that he is driving so fast on a very crowded lane like Rajendra Nagar? Right? But what stops you? What stops you from picking up a fight with this person? And where did this rationality come from? The ideas that have cumulatively evolved over a period of time, which have accumulated in the society, and that is our learned behavior. That at some point of time, you might have consciously or subconsciously learned this idea that even if somebody is doing a wrong, we should intervene only when it is extremely necessary. You cannot go on intervening in all the events that are happening around you. Seekha? So that is why we call it as what? A behavior or an idea or a norm or a value that you have learned over a period of time. And these learned ideas, behaviors, norms, values, they are also reflecting in our material world. They're also reflecting in our what? Material world. Yes. For example, traditionally, dressing as an idea has developed. It has developed almost across all the societies. But which clothes to wear, which are the most acceptable clothes, are different in different societies. For example, in Indian society, if a woman is wearing short dresses, she'll be facing a lot of gauge from the people around her. But that will not be the same case in America. So they have their own notions related to the same idea that is being floated everywhere. Right? Clothes are what? The material culture. Clothes are something that has been created by the human beings as a material artifact that is of use in our day-to-day lives. Okay? Everywhere you go, you find something used for writing, which is called as pen, maybe. Right? And you have come to the common agreement across the societies that something which is of this structure and is used for writing should be called as a pen. If I ask कि पेन लेके आओ तो कोई पानी की गिलास तो नहीं ले आएगा. ऐसा होगा कि नहीं होगा? है कोई इस तरह का? तो फिर उस पर ही बात करते हैं. If I ask somebody to get a pen, will that person bring up a glass of water? No, because we have symbolized the world around us. We have symbolized the world around us. That the something that I see in front of me is a television, is a TV screen. Agree? Something that you wear over your eyes is called as a goggle or a spectacle. Right? So we have symbolized the world around us. And that is what has made the communication pretty easy now, which would have been really difficult in the initial stages. Right? From there, we started to a point where everything is communicated in seconds now. And you also have an urge for communicating. This has also become a non-material aspect of the culture. The urge for communicating everything. Celebrated the birthday today. Cake. Photo. Hota hai? Yes or no? Whatever is your feeling, you want to communicate it over WhatsApp status. Not feeling so good today. होता है ना, लोगों को देखा होगा तुमने. We all have seen this. Why are people actually having this urge? Because this is a value that has developed. Some people get offended if somebody is not putting a status for their birthday wish. Yes or no? So that has become a non-material aspect of the culture. Agree or not? All of these things have developed over a period of time that we have learned. That is why Herzgovitz wanted to define it as what? The study of man and his works. That is everything that has helped us in becoming the humans that we are today. The biological processes as well as the cultural processes combinedly can be used to define this discipline, that is anthropology. And that is also reflected from the different fields in the anthropology that we see here. Right? What was the definition given by Kluckhohn? याद करनी पड़ेगी.
It is the closest to the study of totality of man.
Right? Out of all the disciplines that study various aspects of the human lives, anthropology comes the nearest to the total study of the man. Right? So he is emphasizing on the holistic aspect of the discipline that is anthropology. That anthropology as a discipline is holistic in its orientation. That it takes into account almost every aspect of the human life. Be it biological, even in biological, it is taking care of almost every aspect. In the works, that is the cultural, it is taking care of almost every aspect. In studying the human beings. Yes or no? Right? So in this, we have tried to start with first a general understanding that ultimately the anthropology aims at arriving the universals and the differences. Ultimately, the anthropology aims at arriving at the universals and the differences in the societies. We took the example of marriage being a universal phenomenon. We took the example of rules of marriage where incest taboo is a universal phenomenon, where sexual relationships between closely related individuals is prohibited across the society. It is a taboo. It is a clear no. Somebody who breaks it will be taken very, very badly in the societies. Right? Yet we find that in this universal institution of marriage and this universal rule of incest taboo, we find various variations and differences. Anthropology is also interested in that. Anthropology is also interested in that. Right? We have seen in the case of biological example that we took, that all the humans are part of what? The order primate. Although humans are part of the order primate, where we find chimpanzees also share the order primate with the humans. Monkeys also share the order primate with the humans. The lemurs, tarsiers, and lorises, they also share the order primate with the humans. Agree? But we still find what is the difference between all of these individuals. Right? Like chimpanzees are part of the primate order. One similarity is this. Chimpanzees share almost 98 to 99% of the genetic material with the humans. Right? Yet we find there are considerable differences between both of them, which include what? The idea of erect posture, the idea of bipedalism or habitually bipedalism. Right? Brain size, the symbolic communication in form of language. Agree? So we find certain similarities. You can take another example. For example, the human babies are born premature. And that is not the case in other animals. Human babies, they are born premature. And so is the case in the chimpanzees. But the period of maturity that is required for the human babies is longer as compared to the chimpanzees and their babies. Right? So there is a similarity as well as there is a differences. So we aim at coming up with these universals as well as what? These variations and the differences that are there. That is what we understood in the beginning, that this is ultimately the crux of anthropology or what it means as a discipline by taking the example and the use of certain definitions that were given by various anthropologists, including Kroeber, Herzgovitz, and your Kluckhohn. Got it? Then we started looking at the uniqueness of this discipline, that what has become so unique about the anthropology that has developed over a period of time in the anthropology's development. The first aspect that we talked about was the holism versus the atomism. First was the holism versus the atomism. Holism means it is going to take into account almost all the dimensions of any phenomena that it studies. If it is studying one culture or one society, it is going to take into account almost all the dimensions of that culture or the society. Example being Malinowski, who did his field work in the Trobriand Islands, took into account almost all the aspects of the Trobriand society. including the physical features, including their marital institutions, including their economic life, including their political life. Yes or no? While it is contrary to an approach that is followed by the other disciplines, which is called as the atomistic approach. In that, what happens? They focus or reduce the phenomena to only one feature. They reduce the phenomena to only one aspect of it. Right? Let's take the example of the person speeding up on the bike. एक phenomena, एक event आपने देखा, and you have to explain it through various disciplines. How would the psychology as a discipline explain that? The speeding up is one way of expressing or venting out the anger and the frustration that is within that person. Maybe psychology is reducing it to what? The mental phenomena of that individual. It is not even taking into account what it means to the other people around them. Right? Administration, public administration would see it as non-implementation of the laws related to the traffics and the inherent problem in the administrative structure. That is why this event is occurring time and again. Right? Such approaches can be called as what? Atomistic approach. Anthropology, on the other hand, might take into account almost all the dimensions. Right? Was there any instance of this thing happening in the previous societies? Did people express the rage in the previous societies or in the societies before the modern world came? Right? Is it an acceptable behavior in the overall society? How do the people react when somebody is speeding up on the bike? Right? What are the political institutions doing with the phenomena of speeding up of the bike? Right? What is the economic aspect? That maybe this person has now got a bike. He's so excited. That can be one of the explanations. Or maybe he does not have a BMW. That is why he is riding fast out of frustration. So anthropology as a phenomena takes into account almost all the dimensions of the phenomena that is being studied. That is why it is called as a holistic science or a holistic discipline. Right? For example, the Malinowski's work is one of the most famous works that we can use here to explain the holism of anthropology. Right? And the holism is also reflected in what? Even the definition given by Herzgovitz, even the definition given by Kluckhohn. The holism is reflected there. When Herzgovitz is saying that it is the study of man and his works, what does it leave? It takes into account almost all the aspects of the human existence, the biological existence as well as the social existence, the cultural existence. Right? Kluckhohn, when it says it comes nearest to the total study of mankind, what he is indirectly referring to is the holistic nature of this anthropology as a discipline. Right? Then we talked about other three parameters which has made anthropology unique. The other one is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism. And this is opposed to the earlier ethnocentrism. Second idea is cultural relativism as opposed to the idea of ethnocentrism. Third idea that we see forms an important part of the anthropology is what? The participant observation. The participant observation. And lastly, we see what? It is the cross-cultural comparisons. धीरे धीरे वोकैबुलरी बन रही, इसका मतलब है राइट धीरे धीरे वोकैबुलरी बन रही है. एथनोसेंट्रिसिज्म, कल्चरल रिलेटिविज्म, क्रॉस कल्चरल कंपैरिजंस, पार्टिसिपेंट ऑब्जर्वेशन. इनिशियली दैट इज रिक्वायर्ड. शुरू में ये सब शब्द जो हैं अनजान लगते हैं कि ये कहां से आ गए, और अभी ऐसे तो बहुत सारे वर्ड्स आने बाकी हैं. बट to begin with, now we are getting a grasp of the discipline, that okay, this is the underlying idea or how we should start thinking in this direction. And I had mentioned that answer writing as a process in anthropology can be seen through these parameters. Whenever you have to write an answer related to a phenomena, why not use a field work that has been done on that? And that is what you call as the case study. आप बोलते हो ना case study use करनी है बहुत ज़्यादा. Case study comes from here only. It is nothing but the work that has been done by the anthropologists in their field works. What they have talked about, the different dimensions of the phenomena that they are studying. Yes, no? Agree? People online, are you following?
Yes, sir.
Please turn on the cameras for the sake of it. Human communication is better when it is face to face. है कि नहीं? The idea of anonymity sometimes leads to so many problems, misunderstandings. Social media के साथ क्या problem है? What is the problem with the social media? The communication is anonymous. It exaggerates even the normal phenomena. It reinforces stereotypes because now you have the freedom of speaking whatever comes into your mind. I'm not saying social media is bad per se. It has democratized the ideas of opinions or the sharing of the ideas. But on the other hand, the flip side is this, that the communication is so anonymous that you don't feel responsible in the first place, which leads to instances of bullying, etc. Agree or not? So that is why face-to-face communication is very important. Keep that in mind. So here, if you look at the phenomena, and if you want to write an answer, the case study that you use is nothing but the fieldwork that have been done by the anthropologists. And initially, when somebody is taking anthropology, the first question in mind is, what is case study? Because every topper has talked about it. What is this case study? Right? Some people come with vague ideas about case studies. That's why I'm going to pick up case studies from the newspapers. What about Malinowski, who invested 3 years in Pacific Islands, lived with the natives, did such rigorous work? You do not want to use that case study. You just want to quote something that you see in the newspaper. You have your own inherent ideas about the idea of case study. Whatever you want to express here can be expressed through the ideas of the great works that have been done in the anthropology. And that stands true even for Indian anthropology. There are various famous field works that have been done by the Indian anthropologists to understand the Indian society and its various facets. Right? Whenever you write something, it has to reflect a cultural relativistic idea. Because you as an anthropologist cannot start viewing these tribal cultures from the ethnocentric point of view and start criticizing their practices altogether. Agree or not? You'll have to explain those ideas from a very from the point of view of their own cultures, not from your culture's point of view. Agree? So that has to be reflected there. Yes or no? And when you're writing about something, talk about the other dimensions of that also, the holistic approach. Coming back to our discussion, we talked about holism as an idea. Next thing that we need to talk about is the cultural relativism as a phenomenon. And in general, we have already understood something about the cultural relativism, because how anthropology evolved as a discipline was based on the study of the other cultures or the exotic cultures. Right? Exotic cultures is not the term that we use today, but it was the term that was used by the early anthropologists and early British administrators or early colonialists who went into these new colonies and found cultures which were extremely different from their own cultures. Right? And they had to make a sense of this diversity. They had to make a sense of this difference. And they had an urge to explain these differences, that why do these differences occur in the first place? Or why are these societies so different from our societies? Right? The inherent stereotype that they had towards these societies was that these societies are primitive. These societies are backward. These societies are primitive. These societies are backward. Right? And they started judging their practices or the practices of these so-called primitive and the backward societies from their own cultural lens. Europeans started to view the practices of the so-called primitive or the tribal societies from their own cultural lenses perspective. Right? For example, when they looked at their marital practices, they found that some of these tribes are polygamous. Some of these tribes are polyandrous. And what they found in their own society is that we have an institution of marriage which is monogamy. So they misunderstood it and started saying that monogamy is when somebody achieves the highest stage of the civilization. And they are backward because they have an institution called as polygamy or polyandry. Yes or no? This is what they had explained in the initial years. This kind of a view was called as the ethnocentric view. That is a view that is centered around your ethnicity, not the ethnicity that you are trying to study. Ethnocentric view of culture. Right? This was opposed by the American anthropologists. Which one was, what was the name of that anthropologist? Online? You guys can turn off your mic. You can unmute your mics and speak up in between. That works. Malinowski. It was Franz Boas. It was Franz Boas who for the first time talked about what? Talked about studying the cultures in their historical background. Talked about what? Studying those cultures in their historical context. Whatever practices that they have today, you see them in the historical context. Right? And how to see their historical context? Do they have any written histories? No. So what you need to do? Because the culture is being transmitted through oral tradition and not through written tradition. So their history will be embedded in the folklores, in the myths that they have, in the stories that they tell to each other, in the songs that they sing with each other. Agree or not? So he talked about explaining the ideas in their historical context. If you want to study a culture, you don't see it through your own lens. To understand that culture, you go into their histories, which is the oral history that these people are telling about themselves. Right? This evolved into a phenomena that all cultures are different and not necessarily high or low, superior or inferior. This kind of an explanation led to an understanding that what? The cultures can be different, but not necessarily superior or inferior, or primitive or forward, or savage or civilized. Following? कौन है बताओ बैकवर्ड और क्यों है बैकवर्ड करेंगे इस पे बात तो बैकवर्ड है नो not wearing clothes. Exactly what he is trying to say are the ethnocentric ideas. Because this is what you have learned. Why do you consider yourself to be the most evolved ones? Or the most civilized one? Or the more better off ones? Kyun bhai? What is so good about you? You are living in polluted cities. Right? You are living in cities which are flooded. You are living in cities where accident is a very common phenomena. You can die in a whisker. पूरी प्लानिंग करी आईएएस बनेंगे रोड एक्सीडेंट मर गए और आप कह रहे हो हम सिविलाइज्ड हैं right you are living in cities which are under fog, which are under toxic smog for almost 3 to 4 months. How do you consider yourself as civilized or the most advanced ones? You compare it with the tribal life, living in the lap of nature, जहां तुम पैसे खर्च करके जाते हो. Agree or not? You spend a lot of money to go into the forest. That I visited XYZ National Park and its core area. Tribal तो वहीं रह रहा पहले. Right? You do village tourism. Go and eat farm fresh vegetables. वो डायरेक्ट पेड़ से तोड़ के आम खा रहा है. आप कार्बाइड से पका हुआ आम खा रहे हैं. करेंगे इस पे बात. पहले बात तो समझे अपन, इसको मेन मुद्दा तो समझे. They are happy in forest, we are depressed in the cities. With urbanization came its own set of problems. There was a Hindi movie in which there was a song. सीने में जलन आंखों में तूफान सा क्यों है, इस शहर में हर शख्स परेशान सा क्यों है. There is a song. Agree or not? So our life, although we might consider ourselves as developed, but is this development superior in any sense as compared to the tribal ways of life. You have all the medical facilities. You have all the medical facilities. You have all the idea of knowing what is good for you and what is bad for you. Right? But this over information sometimes can lead to such anxieties which are uncontrollable. डॉक्टर साहब बताएंगे ज्यादा बेटर, कौन कौन डॉक्टर हैं वो सारे बताएंगे. हर आदमी जब अपनी बीमारी को चेक करता है उसे कैंसर निकलता है लास्ट में गूगल पे, होता ही नहीं होता है. दिस इंफॉर्मेशन इज एक्चुअली प्रॉब्लमैटिक फॉर अस टू सम एक्सटेंट. मैं ये नहीं कह रहा हूं कि ये गलत है. आई एम नॉट सेइंग दिस इज रॉन्ग एब्सोल्युटली. This medical science is helpful to us only when a medical practitioner is exercising that knowledge, not you who does not understand it properly. Right? The problem and the notion of backwardness and forwardness, the notion that somebody is primitive and somebody is civilized, came only when these cultures came into contact with each other. Right? And that has been the course of the history. Now that it has become so mainstream, this contact has become so unavoidable. Even the tribals are now dependent on the modern cultures, on the modern civilization. Right? Now they are transacting in monetary economy. Right? So in one sense, we are the ones who have disrupted their way of life.
Started like communicating to us like
they are becoming mainstreamized.
Will we define them as a civilization now because they are using a space?
So this is what actually was initially used as a term, the civilizing mission by the Britishers, that we have to civilize these natives. Civilized unko. अब क्या है कि these terms have become so vague, which were actually used as stereotypes in the initial parts. Their histories are now being recorded. Their knowledge is now being recorded digitally. Right? We find instances where people are talking about the conservation of their ideas and the knowledge, the traditional knowledge. And questions also come up for comparing of the traditional knowledge with the mainstream knowledge. Right? So rather than seeing these ideas as distinct now, we are following a very collaborated approach. That whatever good we have, we should offer them. And whatever good they have, we should take from them. Rather than just viewing them as backward and saying that we are forward or we are civilized. Convinced or not convinced? भाई जैसे तुम बड़े हो गए मान लो. You have now become a grown-up person. Cross the age of maturity, 18 साल. 18 साल के हो गए ना सब लोग? कोई नीचे तो नहीं है. राइट? एवरीबडी इज अबाउ 18 नाउ. और तुम किसी बच्चे को कहो यार तुझे कुछ आइडिया नहीं है अभी. मैं बताता हूं, मुझे सब पता है क्योंकि मैं ज्यादा जीवन देख चुका हूं. सिमिलरली योर ग्रैंडफादर टेलिंग यू द सेम थिंग, योर फादर टेलिंग यू द सेम थिंग, रादर देन एक्नॉलेजिंग दैट इन योर स्टेज यू आर डूइंग गुड. थर्ड क्लास के बच्चे से आप सोच रहे हो तुझे मेलिनोस के बारे में नहीं आइडिया है. Is it the right thing to say? Is it the right expectation from that child who is 3 years old or who is, let's say, 8 years old or 7 years old? It is like that only. It's a very vague analogy, but this is how it is. You are a grown-up now. You are dealing with a child who is less than 10 years of the age, and then you are throwing your knowledge. Somebody who has already taken 4 attempts in the UPSC, right? Discouraging a fresher, saying that you do not even know this question. Oh my God. Your selection is difficult. But the result turns out to be contrary sometimes. The first attempters do really well in their first attempts. While the 4-attempter Baba, the so-called knowledgeable guy, does not have much to explain about the non-selection in some of these exams. Right? Just a vague analogy, but this is how it works. This is how it has happened. That when these Europeans came into contact with them, they started judging their cultures as the backwards. But the later understanding was that they are doing it good in their own right. Whatever practices they are doing, it is good in their own right for these cultures. we should refrain from judging them through our cultural lens. Because the aim of the anthropology is also to study these cultures or these tribes. The aim of anthropology is to do what? Study these so-called different cultures or distinct societies. Agree? So this new approach then concretized into a term that is called as cultural relativism, that is starting to view the cultural practices of these different cultures in their own cultural context, rather than trying to judge these cultural practices from the outsider's perspective, which is generally a judgment or a stereotype on those practices. Like our friend here was saying, that the people in the Amazon, they do not know how to read. मैं तुमको जज नहीं कर रहा हूं अभी, don't worry. You are right in your own right. ठीक है? And then later, anthropologists like Sahlins and Service, they actually started to compare the so-called primitive societies with the modern societies, and they started coining the term that the hunter-gatherers on this planet during the course of the evolution were the original affluent class on this planet. Hunter-gatherers were the original affluent class on this planet because they used to work only for 18 hours a week. On the other hand, human beings who are slogging 14 hours a day, 16 hours a day, do not have much time of leisure with them. So they could get their food in 18 hours. If they worked for 18 hours a week, they could get a hunt, right? And in the lap of the nature, they had enough to eat and consume. In fact, they were the most healthiest ones. Whoever could survived for a longer period of time, was far more fit as compared to the later cultures. He termed them as what? The original affluent class, these hunter-gatherers. Coming to the next idea, that although cultural relativism looks very good, looks very impressive, looks very attractive, right? Gives us a new way of understanding the diversity in the culture. Gives us a very new perspective on understanding diversity in the culture. Because if you have an ethnocentric lens, you might start judging the different religions. Let's say you belong to Hinduism, you start judging Islam, Christianity, Jainism, Buddhism. Somebody belongs to Christianity, start judging Buddhism, Hinduism, and their practices. This is exactly what was happening during the European expansion or during the colonialism. Right? So this looks like a very impressive approach, that you start seeing the Hinduism's practices in the Hinduism's context. So that will be a better way to do it. That will be a better way to do it. But the problem arises, how do you see some of these practices which on the face of it look very regressive, which look inhuman? For example, some of these tribal societies have had a practice of headhunting. Now, how do you explain it? In the postmodernism, in the first class, I explained what? When Rosetta Ronaldo went to study the cultures in the Philippines, he found what? That they had a phenomena that somebody, when somebody died in their family, they would go out for a headhunting out of rage. They would go for what? Headhunting out of rage. Right? And he could only understand it once he himself felt the same thing, because his wife died on the field work. Right? You can go on explaining, you can go on justifying these practices, that these practices are fine because it's there in their cultural context. What do we do now? Right? Some tribes, for example, if you go, you'll find they are doing infanticide. Female infanticide. It's a common practice in their societies. There are Todas in the Nilgiri. There are Todas in the Nilgiri who practice female infanticide long back. And because of which they have a problem which is called as poor sex ratio, which has led to a marital practice which is called as polyandry there. Which has led to a marital practice which is called as polyandry, where one woman marries more than one man. Right? And if these men are brothers, it is called as fraternal polyandry. And if these brothers are not men, non-fraternal polyandry. Right? What to do with such practices, which look very inhuman on the face of it? Witch hunting. Some women are in these cultures regarded as witches, and then they are killed by throwing stones at them. By throwing stones at them. Thrones, nahi? Yeah. So what to do? What to make out of these practices? If you start seeing them through the cultural relativistic perspective, you are going to justify them. Anybody would want to attempt? Sounds very confusing, everything, right?
Sir, but we'll judge them, then it's ethnocentrism, right?
हाँ वो तो है ही ना, डबल वैमी है, डबल एजेड स्वॉर्ड है.
यही तो. Sir, then what we should take from this
वो तो मैं
practice?
बताऊंगा, मैं तुमसे पूछ रहा हूँ, मैं तो बताऊंगा ही, ऑफ कोर्स, मेरा तो काम है.
Take these practices just for the academic purpose, but we should not go for justifying.
Very good. See, first thing is to understand these phenomena, how they are happening. First thing is to understand these phenomena properly. And to be able to understand these phenomena, that why are they doing witch hunting in the first place? Or why do they have the practice of infanticide in the first place? Or why do they have the practice of head hunting in the first place? There are Konyak Nagas who have also been involved in head hunting in Nagaland traditionally. Now this might have stopped to some extent. Right? At some point of time, Mizos had a practice that if a baby's mother died, the child would also be buried along with the mother, because of the concern that what would happen to this child now. Right? So such grave practices can sometimes be justified if you start using cultural relativism as a philosophical tool. Right? But what we need to understand is anthropology as a discipline has always aimed to do what? Understand the other cultures, so-called exotic cultures, so-called different cultures or the diverse cultures. This is what anthropology is trying to do. That is the main goal of anthropology as a discipline. When it claims to be a science, when it claims to be a discipline, when it claims to be an academic quest, it wants to explain what? It wants to understand these phenomena. So what the anthropologists then say is that you use cultural relativism as a tool to understand these phenomena holistically. Right? And only if some of these practices will not stand the scrutiny in terms of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. No doubt about it. Some of these practices will look human, will look inhuman. Right? For example, cannibalism for that matter. They are inhuman in nature, no doubt. But to understand these first, this is the first step, only then any intervention can be thought about, which will be acceptable to even these cultures. Because if you start viewing them from an ethnocentric view, you will directly go and ban the practice. Without understanding that, even if you ban, you might have banned this practice, but are they going to accept your ban? Are they going to accept this intrusion by the outsiders? Are they going to accept this intrusion by the outsiders? And these cultures are particularly very particular about their distinct identity. They do not like intrusion. Right? This rage for distinct identity is what is leading to the idea of so many ethnic identities in the northeastern states, and leading to so many ethnic conflicts also, where their conflict is not just with the state of India, some of these tribes that live in the northeastern states, but the conflict is also with what? Amongst the tribes themselves. Inter-ethnic conflict is also there. What you see in the case of Manipur is basically an inter-ethnic conflict. Agree or not? It is because of their own understanding of being a distinct identity or a culture, which has had its own historical, cultural process, which has made them distinct. That is their understanding. Agree? So the later understanding is that you use cultural anthropology at best, this cultural relativism, as a tool to understand these so-called inhuman practices, only then an intervention can be thought about. If you understand these practices, that will be a long-lasting intervention. For example, what is the way in which social reform can be brought up in a society?
Initiatives from the members of society.
It is important. What is important is the members initiated themselves, rather than some outsider imposing that ban. Dowry has been banned in India. Looks paradoxical कि हर आदमी तो dowry ले रहा है. अभी भी dowry is a prominent phenomena. Dowry is legally banned in India. Has the practice of dowry vanished altogether? Right? So rather, an intervention by the state could have been in the measure of communicating, increasing awareness in these cultures which practice dowry, because dowry is not the most famous type of economic exchange that happens in all the societies. ये anthropology हमको सिखाता है. Because we belong to the mainstream society and we have heard this term dowry so often that we understand that dowry is the only type of economic exchange that happens in the times of marriage. On the contrary, in some of the tribal societies and the lower caste groups, there is a practice called as bride price. क्या बोलते हैं उसको? Bride price, which is opposed to the dowry. Dowry is when the family of the bride gives the money to the groom's family. That is dowry. While bride price is opposed to this, in which the person who is getting married, his family will pay to the family from whom the bride is coming into their family. उसमें भी bride को पैसे नहीं मिल रहे हैं. पैसे तो परिवार को मिल रहे हैं. Bride का तो वहां भी status वही है. Bride is not actually getting that money, is not getting that amount. But there is bride price as a phenomenon. Right? So an intervention in the so-called societies which are practicing dowry, the intervention has to be to reform these societies rather than an outsider trying to control it. Outside, the laws have their own set of way of stopping these practices. The laws can play only one part in it, but the laws cannot play the only part in it. Laws are necessary, but they are not sufficient. Laws are necessary. No doubt banning dowry is required. But does that solve the problem? The law also bans that if you jump a traffic light, you can be fined. कौन कौन नहीं करता है? सब आदर्श नागरिक हो, ideal citizens. Has anybody jumped traffic light in his or her lifetime? किया ही है भाई. And sometimes we are proud of this achievement कि हम इंडियन हैं, हम तो ऐसे ही करते हैं. Agree or not? So even though the law stops it, cannabis or marijuana is banned in India. कहीं पे लीगल हो तो please convey. But as far as my knowledge goes, it is banned in India. Right? Do people not smoke? They smoke around. Agree or not? Cannabis is very easily available. Right? It is part of all the college cultures now. भाई frankly बात करेंगे तभी तो बात समझ में आएगी. बोलो कि हाँ हमने देखा है 4 लोगों को. अगर नहीं देखा है तो बात अलग है. देखा ही होगा सबने.
Yes, sir.
Everybody has seen this as a common phenomenon. Some of you might be. ठीक है. Let's not get into that because the lecture is getting recorded. Right? So does the banning always yield the result? So similarly, an outsider intervention in this form, will it result in any kind of change, even if the practice is inhuman in the first place? Only if the culture is understood properly. And to understand this culture properly, you need an objective lens. You need objectivity rather than going with your ethnocentric point of view. For example, we talk about women empowerment and upliftment of the women. Everybody is talking, this is a famous buzzword now. But who are talking about women empowerment? the men have their own ideas about women empowerment. Right? And you might have seen such discussions going on sometimes about what exactly should women empowerment look like? What should be the limits of women empowerment? कि women are free to wear whatever they like, पर ऐसे तो नहीं पहनना चाहिए. सुना है? ऐसी बातें सुनी है? ये बातें एथनोसेंट्रिक बाहर की बातें हैं. जो इतने सालों से स्टीरियोटाइप्स पाले हैं, उनका एक एक करके टूटना तय है एंथ्रोपोलॉजी में. Whatever stereotypes you have been living with for long, they will be broken in this journey in the next 5-6 months. Because that is the crux of anthropology. That is why this discipline was born in the first place. It started with the same way in which we perceive things. But later on, it developed into, it took a very different direction with the works of the pioneering anthropologists. Agree? So cultural relativism as an idea was about or was opposed to the initial ideas which were ethnocentric in their orientation. When the British or when the colonial expansion, when the expansion of the European countries happened, which led to the colonialism, which made them meet the cultures which were distinct from their own cultures, which were termed as other cultures or exotic cultures in the first place, and were considered as primitive in the stage of savagery or in the stage of barbarism. Right? And on the contrary, they considered their cultures as very, very well developed or the civilized cultures. Right? And this kind of an approach where you started seeing their practices as backward because you considered yourselves as developed or civilized was termed as an approach which is called as what? Ethnocentric approach. While Franz Boas talked about what? Seeing their cultural practices in their own historical context. Seeing their cultural practices in their own historical context. To be able to understand the phenomena objectively, to understand their practices objectively. Objectively means you are not imposing your ideas on those. You are trying to understand. Yes, no. Yes, this was termed as a cultural relativism as a phenomena. Later on, the questions were raised against cultural relativism as an idea. That if you start following the ideas of cultural relativism, it might lead to acceptance of some of the most inhuman practices like cannibalism, like headhunting, like female infanticide. Right? For that, the argument that was forwarded by the anthropologists was that you only see it as a tool rather than, again the final word on that practice. Because if you see it as a tool, only then you will be able to understand the phenomena objectively. And once you understand the phenomena objectively, only then you can think of an intervention which will bring about a change which is endogenous rather than an exogenous change in these societies. Agree? Likho.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I had a doubt from the previous class. We had written in the case study of Franz Boas that it is said that Franz Boas does not belong to any school of thought. But sir, why then we relate him with historical particularism?
See, whatever schools of thought we have had. For example, E.B. Tyler belongs to evolutionist school. E.B. Tyler belongs to evolutionist school. But they have also used ideas like functionalism. They have also tried to explain that this practice, that is one practice, is playing a part in the overall existence of the society. They have also used those ideas. But the prominent idea that they forwarded was evolutionism. The prominent idea or the most appealing idea of Franz Boas was historical particularism. Agree or not? If you look at holism as an idea, let's again come back to holistic ideas. If you look at holism as an idea, we have studied about what? Structure functionalism and functionalism. We just took an idea about that in the first class. What exactly was this functionalism or structure functionalism? At a broad level, participant approach was there. It was propounded by Malinowski because he did this participant approach. But the main crux of the functionalist approach is that a society is composed of parts. A society is composed of various parts. Right? And this composition of these parts can be seen as the structure. Can be seen as the structure of the society. And this was on the basis of the organismic analogy. That is, society is also like a organism or an animal, which is composed of different parts. Like the human body, if you see it, it is composed of various parts. Heart is there, kidney is there, liver is there, lungs are there, brain is there, different parts are there. Right? And every part is playing its role to make it functional. Every part is playing its role to make it what? Functional. Right? So every part is playing a role to make it functional. For example, a car is there. If radiator breaks, car stops. Every part is playing a role in the functioning of the car. Right or wrong? So this integrated approach, can it not be termed as a holistic approach? Where you see the interrelationship between the different parts and the role that they are playing in the overall maintenance of the system of which they are part. Simple analogy is the analogy of the human body. If heart stops working tomorrow, God forbid, what happens? You merge from the natural world to the supernatural world. This is what happens. या किसी के पास और कोई आइडिया है? यही स्टोरी सुनी हमने कि there is a supernatural phenomena. This is the story that we have been told time and again, the most powerful story, that is religion. That once you die here, you go to heaven or hell. And there you meet the so-called gods. Right? उनके आसपास पहुंच जाते हो, थोड़ा सा विलीन हो जाते हो. आत्मा ब्रह्म में विलीन हो जाती है. This is the idea that we have. Agree or not? So if one part stops working, the whole body becomes dysfunctional. It does not work. If heart stops working, heart कहते हैं कि मैं बहुत important हूं, तो liver कहेगा आओ बात करते हैं. If liver says I am very important, kidney might say, let's have a discussion. Right? Everything is working, but brain stops working. Which means what? Something is functional because all the parts are working and they are working in an integrated fashion, and every part is contributing in the maintenance of the overall system of which it is part. Again, can be seen as what? The idea of functionalism only. It can be seen as a holistic approach to understanding the phenomena. ठीक है? आ रहा है समझ में? लिखो, write down. Before writing cultural relativism as the heading, just summarize this holism in the end. Holism last likha tha apne kal. What was the last thing that we wrote yesterday? We wrote Franz Boas's work and we wrote Malinowski's work, right? Then just write down. Now today the challenge is the holism is transforming. Because initially it was understood with what? If you are studying a cultural studies, it's all the aspects, right? Today, all the other disciplines are developed very well. Political science is very well developed. Economics is very well developed. Psychology is very well developed. Sociology is very well developed. So now it is an interdependent approach that you might be a biological evolutionist, but take help from forensic sciences. Take help from the medical sciences to understand your ideas that you want to explain. So with the improvement, the transformation is happening where different sub-disciplines are becoming interdependent, and anthropology is drawing heavily from these disciplines to pursue its holistic agenda. Write down. Next point, or conclusion in the end, how it is transforming. Write a heading, subheading as how the holism is transforming. How the holism is transforming. Write down. With the expansion of knowledge, it is not possible for a single anthropologist to study everything that has to do with human beings. That has to do with human beings. With increasing specialization, देखो, notes are one part of it. Whatever you are writing here are one part of it. But feel free to expand them as and when your knowledge expands in the later classes. Holism, whatever you have studied, just start thinking, does it reflect a holistic idea? Does it reflect the cultural relativism idea? Start questioning your ideas. That is how the interlinkages that we want to write in the examination, in the form of answers, they can be used there. Because what happens is we start understanding these phenomena in silos, in isolation, and forget to understand the whole discipline as an integrated discipline. Okay? Later you'll understand the importance of this approach, but just write it down right now. With specialization, anthropologists communicate with fellow anthropologists working in diverse fields, and use information created by others in pursuit of the holistic study of man. Study of man, by man नहीं, by तो man है ही है. चिंपैंजी तुमको थोड़ी पढ़ रहा है कि नहीं? किसी को पढ़ा चिंपैंजी ने आज तक? लिखो. Next heading, write down cultural relativism. Second unique point about anthropology is cultural relativism. Now that you are already introduced to so many terms, किसी ने कोशिश की जाके कुछ सर्च करने की कि फ्रांस बोआस कौन आदमी थे, ब्रेंस्लो मैलिनोव्स्की कौन थे, क्या किया था उन्होंने जीवन में ऐसा, कितना इंपॉर्टेंट उनका नाम है समाज में? Have such kind of curiosity. At least try to go and search these ideas on your own also. Because otherwise at the end of it, there will be so many things that I have communicated to you without you giving it a thought on your own. That is what is called as processing the knowledge that has been discussed in the class. The processing part, you will do it at a later stage. So start doing it right away. Because this is what expands your horizons. If I just keep on repeating the term Franz Boas, Malinowski, Radcliffe Brown, Robert Redfield, you'll not be able to remember them. But if you know something about these individuals and what they have done, you yourself will remember. It will be easy for you to remember. आज मैं तुमको 10 नाम दे दूं लिख के कि इनको याद करो, सारे याद ही नहीं रहेंगे. But if you remember a story related to those names, it will be easy for you to remember. It will be easy for us to remember. And this is how human beings have learned over the evolution. This is how children learn. They learn by playing. So you also not stop playing. You also start playing now with the content that you study. Start playing with whatever you have studied. You have this curiosity that what exactly are we studying here? Right? Some curiosity will be required on your part also. So that these terms should not be difficult. कि बाद में historical particularism का नाम लूं और तुम नाम ले रहे हो Robert Redfield का. होता है ऐसा. People who are taking mains this year, if you ask them about these fields and the names of the thinkers, they are not able to remember the name. Forget about writing a good answer in the examination. They are just happy that they have qualified prelims, but of no use now. If you do not have this broad understanding, the subject has to be on the tips. These ideas have to be on tips to be able to write a good answer in the examination. First part is knowledge gathering that we are doing here. Do it very diligently. Whatever you are reading now, you have started. I hope you have started reading the SCRT book, right? As well as the Anthropology, the Amber and Amber, chapter 1. ठीक है, Kerala State STRT, at least try to read it cover to cover, and that too very quickly, to get a grasp of the important terms and terminology that are used in anthropology. Sapiens bhi padh lo. It's a very interesting read, no doubt. Right, of course, like a novel, it's not a textbook. Okay? Initially, don't try to get into so much depth, because this is the mistake that we do. We try to understand everything on the first day and then we are lost. Keep space open that you will be learning some things, some clarity will be there at the later stage. Today, you are introduced to the term, let's say, cultural relativism. It will only grow over a period of time. This has to be kept in mind while you are studying everything. And then you yourself will appreciate that whatever we are studying is actually from a cultural relativistic perspective only. Agree? So write down now. Cultural relativism. Cultural relativism. It is the attitude it is an attitude that a society's customs and ideas should be viewed within the context of that society's problems and opportunities. Within that society's problems and opportunities. It is the principle that all cultural practices are equally valid and hence every culture or any part of a culture should be viewed in terms of its own logic, and rationale. Write down. It is the idea that culture should be analyzed. It is the idea that culture should be analyzed with reference to their own histories, and values, rather than according to the values of another culture. Next, write down in this ethnocentrism, not a subheading, but just the definition or what exactly ethnocentrism refers to. Right? Just ethnocentrism, write down. Dash karke likho. Cultural relativism developed as a response to the ethnocentric approach. which was characterized by judging other cultures, which was characterized by judging other cultures, को कोट में डाल दो, other cultures, from the perspective of one's own culture. It breeds from the notion, it means ethnocentrism, it breeds from the notion that one's own culture is more beautiful, rational, and closer to perfection, than any other culture. Right? Now write down. Early evolutionists like E.B. Tyler, Henry Morgan, were ethnocentric in the sense that they considered the Western Victorian civilization to be the highest stage of human cultural development. Right? They gave a scheme of evolution. They gave a scheme of social evolution or cultural evolution. They gave a scheme of social or cultural evolution which followed the following sequence. कौन सी sequence थी? Barbarism, civilization. 3 stages. Savagery, barbarism, and civilization. These 3 stages. Right? And what they considered is that this stage, which is synonymous with the Western culture, which was their own culture, as what? As the highest stage of cultural development. यही बोला था उन्होंने, right? Similarly, they dealt with a similar sequence for other social institutions also, right? So just write down for the sake of it. Similarly, they talked about the evolution of whenever you write evolution in social cultural anthropology, write social evolution or cultural evolution, right? Similarly, they talked about social evolution of various cultural institutions. Social evolution of various cultural institutions in the same fashion. In the same fashion. For example, now write down first the institution of marriage. So first was promiscuity. In the institution of marriage, first stage was promiscuity. Promiscuity to polygamy. And polygamy to monogamy. And what would be the ethnocentric idea? They considered that monogamy is the marital practices used by the Western society which has achieved the highest stage of cultural evolution. Right? So according to them, monogamy is the best. That is the ultimate journey that everybody has to follow. कुछ भी कर लो, लास्ट में monogamy करनी है तुमको. मतलब तुमको नहीं, मतलब कल्चर को. तुमको भी करनी होगी. जिस कल्चर में monogamy है तो you'll also have to marry monogamously. Right? Similarly, for religion, they talked about in the same sense. For the institution of the religion, they started with animism. Animism to polytheism. Polytheism. To lastly, monotheism, which again would be considered as what? The religion of the civilized society. Monotheism, reflecting according to them. Isko sach nahi maan lena as it is. It is according to them. It is not according to, it is not a universal truth that they are trying to convey here. This according to them, this is their idea, where they started considering themselves as what? The people who have achieved the highest stage of cultural evolution or the civilization stage. Right? So does the evolution stop here? According to evolutionists, civilization has already been achieved. Right? Then why is the Western world running here and there? Ultimately, it is embedded in the idea of progressivism. They themselves were inspired by the progressivist ideas that were there in the Europe at that time. Which means, although you are better as compared to so many others, but still you have to evolve and progress. You cannot stop and be complacent about your progress. That is why they self-critique their cultures also. That is why they self-critique their cultures. And they are continuously on this journey of improving their cultural evolution or so-called idea of progress. ठीक है? लिखना नहीं है, but in general, we need to understand that it does not stop here. Journey does not stop here. That is why some of these they have criticized their own cultures also. Because without a culture, the progress according to them without the critique, the progress in the cultures will stop. ठीक है? Now we have seen two important strands here. One was your ethnocentrism. The reaction to this was in the form of cultural relativism. What would be the extreme end of this? We started with ethnocentrism, which is starting to consider your culture as the most advanced one and considering other cultures as the backward ones. Right? It started by seeing these cultures in their own context. Right? In this, we find that there is a possibility that you might start to justify some of the inhuman practices. There's a possibility, right? There's another end to this story. Okay. Anybody else? ये बाहर इतने डेवलपमेंट की आवाज आ रही है, देखो जोर से. Highest stage of civilization. Horn,
We
ambulance.
end up reversing it.
ये कोई evolution नहीं है understanding of the culture की. These are only three ends of understanding. One end is ethnocentric, that you view others by your own cultural lens and then judge कि ये बेकार है. Inherent in ethnocentrism is you judge the other cultures to be backward or poor or not so developed like you. And the inherent assumption is that you are the best one. This is like cultural narcissism. Is it not? It is cultural narcissism, where we are considered as the best. Baki sab hame nahi pata. The other one is I am also good, you are also good. Let's understand your practices. Let's know more about from you, more about your culture from yourself. What you exactly feel about it. Why polygamy is prevalent in your society. Why do you practice polytheism? Why do you practice animism? Let's understand what is the context in which they are practicing. Third end to this can be
adopting their practices. You are better. You are better. Other countries better than us.
very good. Cultural glorification of the other cultures. Cultural glorification. ये भी खराब है और ये भी खराब है. Cultural glorification. For example, majority of the Indians, when they started to westernize and modernize, they had the assumption that the Western cultures are actually superior cultures, or they are great cultures, or English is the great language. Right? Western lifestyle is seen to be more superior. That's glorification of the culture. That can also lead to instance of inferiority in your own culture. Right? The growth of Hindi has been hampered because of such glorification of the English. Although the problem is, even if you glorify or not glorify English, English has become a language of employment now. So it's a necessary evil. The problem is because of the importance that English has attained in our societies, we tend to understand what? We tend to see that English is the only way out. We forget to understand that you can learn English, but at the same time, you can also learn your own languages. This kind of approach we see in the upbringing in the families, where the children are taught to in the English language only in some of the areas. Right? Mostly a North Indian phenomena. Yes or no? सुना है कि नहीं सुना है कहीं पे? तुम्हारे घर में किसी ने इंग्लिश में बात नहीं की तुमसे? अभी जो बच्चे हैं, if you are seeing the kids and their upbringing, the parents tend to talk in English only. The whole understanding is that if the child does not learn English, the child does not have a future. Right? Make him learn English, but make him learn the native language also, because through the language only you are going to learn your own culture. The inherent idea in making the child only focus upon English is the glorification of the other culture. Yes or no? Thought-provoking or not?
Ethnocentrism and cultural glorification are not two ends of the spectrum, but rather cultural glorification is a byproduct of ethnocentrism.
Ethnocentrism stands from the point of view of the power equation, from the position of considering yourself as the superior. For example, I might discard English altogether by saying that Hindi is the best language. Ethnocentric. And I might discard Hindi by saying English is the best language, which is not my language, which is the other culture's language, is glorification. And I take a middle ground. My language is also good. English is also good. Agree or not? Ab likho. The underlying belief The underlying belief is the networking audible online?
Yes, sir.
The underlying belief was that the Western society was superior to the so-called, in quotes, primitive societies. This was used to justify practices like racism, colonialism, and ideas like white supremacy, all in quotes, white supremacy, white man's burden, civilizing mission, and the backwardness of tribal and indigenous populations. And the backwardness of tribal and indigenous populations. ठीक है? Then write down Franz Boas, next point. Franz Boas, the American anthropologist, forcefully rejected any correlation between race and level of cultural evolution. Implying cultural evolution, implying the superiority of the Western culture, implying superiority of the Western cultures. His opposition to ethnocentrism, led to the development of a position which was later referred to as cultural relativism. This position or view was developed by Franz Boas but was consolidated, but was consolidated by the use of term cultural relativism by Alan Locke. Alan Locke. Okay? So this term actually was coined by him. But what exactly what was being conveyed, Franz Boas had already started talking about that. Okay? Then write down. Thus to understand, write down at the end. Thus to understand cultural practices. Thus to understand cultural practices, anthropologists need to understand them in the context of those other cultures. Right? Then write down issues with cultural relativism. Just a brief of it because it is a topic for discussion later, where we will discuss it when we study with culture. Okay? Just write down issues with cultural relativism. Anthropologists attempt to explain objectively. Anthropologists attempt to explain objectively practices such as headhunting in Konyak Nagas, comma, infanticide, Konyak, Nagas, and infanticide amongst the Todas. And witchcraft, etc. Right? Then write down, however, Nilgiri, Todas of Nilgiri. देखो क्या होता है कि even when the anthropologists were all against stereotyping, right? They were branded as such. They themselves branded these tribes as such. For example, when Todas were studied, Todas of Nilgiri is one such name that is used for them. The term that is used for them is also polyandrous Todas. Right? The headhunting Nagas. Stereotypical. तो सारी प्रॉब्लम इन्होंने खुद ने क्रिएट की, फिर खुद से सॉल्व भी करी. Primitive, but not so primitive. They use these terms and again started questioning their own ideas. These ideas themselves are pretty wrong. But now, because there's a legacy that we have been using these terms, let's keep on using them. For example, the people who live in the Arctic region, what is the term that we use for them? Eskimos. Eskimos is now considered a derogatory term. Eskimos is now a derogatory term. Why is it? Because the term is originally evolved from one of the local languages, Algonquin language. Right? In that language, this term refers to raw meat eaters. उन्होंने एक प्रैक्टिस देखी, स्टीरियोटाइप बना दिया कि एस्किमो है. Right? Now the term that is used for them is Inuits, which is their name, which is quite often used by themselves to refer to themselves. Inuits. Eskimos had an ethnocentric notion that was developed by the outsiders who saw them, found a term, and used it. Right? For example, there were certain tribes who were branded as criminal tribes. है कि नहीं? So can we appreciate this? Okay, then right. However, avoiding any value judgment. However, avoiding any value judgment by the anthropologists is sometimes misconstrued as a justification for such practices. However, it needs to be understood that avoiding any value judgment, does not signal the support to such acts. Does not signal the support to such acts. It is at best an attempt to understand. It is at best an attempt to understand these practices objectively. And lastly, write down, and as such, cultural relativism, which stands for maintaining a posture of neutrality, which aims at maintaining a posture of neutrality, should be seen as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. ये रास्ता है. Should be seen as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Right? This is only a measure. This is only a means. This is only a way which will make you understand the phenomena at hand properly. But if the means are wrong, the ends will be also wrong in the first place. Means and correlation, pata hai? Means and correlation. Hard work is a means to achieving success in UPSC. But hard work cannot be an end in itself. Some people can also achieve it through smart work. Right? Some things are means to some end. This is a means to an end. Money is a means to a happy life. But money is not an end in itself. But it has become an end in itself for certain people. Is it not? So some things are considered as means to an end. If you start considering themselves as end in itself, then they become a problem for you. And that is what has been seen as a problem when you start seeing cultural relativism as doing what? Justifying these practices. It is not justifying. It is only trying to understand it objectively. It is only a means. It is only a tool. Test series is a means to an end. है कि नहीं means to an end? या क्या है? End in itself. कि देते चले जाओ. फेल होते चले जाओ और देते चले जाओ. End in itself. Getting it? So means and correlation. So if you start seeing it as a means to some greater end, which is not clear, what exactly is the end? So that is why to understand these phenomena objectively, we need to understand or still keep on using the idea of cultural relativism in understanding these so-called diverse or different cultures. Okay? Next, write down. Next, write down. Participant observation. Participant observation or dash write down fieldwork tradition. Participant observation and fieldwork tradition. And you will find questions on these terms: cultural relativism, ethnocentrism, fieldwork tradition and anthropology. Participant observation as a method, as a research method. Okay? So just we are getting a glimpse of all these ideas. Participant observation or fieldwork. How did it start? Who is known as the most famous person for this?
Malinowski.
Malinowski. The problem here is when anthropology as a discipline actually started, it actually started as a discipline when it was floated as a discipline at the Oxford University. That is when the ideas started to converge. कि अभी academic discipline बन गया है. Now it has become an academic way of life, academic discipline now. Right? The propounders of these initial institutions were whom? E.B. Tyler, L.H. Morgan. These were the pioneers in the field of anthropology. And they had relied on which kind of data? Secondary data. A data that was sent to them by the Christian missionaries and the administrators of those times. The Europeans started to colonize the world, sent the administrators to these areas, remote areas, and sent Christian missionaries also. Christian missionaries also followed them. Because now the Britishers are going, or the French are going, or the Dutch are going. So Christian missionaries also followed the same line. They also started to travel along with them. कल्चरल रिलेटिविज्म तो हो गया ना, ठीक है. तो हम एजुकेट कर रहे हैं मेन स्ट्रीम कल्चर को कि ट्राइबल कल्चर को बैकवर्ड मत सुनो, मत मानो. वो कर सकते हैं बाद में, पॉसिबिलिटी है, पर ये नहीं क्लेम कर रही है एंथ्रोपोलॉजी कि हम सॉल्व कर देंगे सारी प्रॉब्लम. इट कैन बी यूज्ड, पॉसिबिलिटी इज देयर. For example, you understand the Sentinelese want to remain isolated on Andaman Nicobar Islands. Right? We let them remain isolated. We do not interfere. Sometimes we see that our intrusion is going to lead to so many problems. It might lead to vanishing away of that tribe itself because the population is so less. And they are not immune to so many diseases that we see today. Majority of the native Indian Americans have died because of the European colonization. Because they introduced new diseases, conquest, wars, and diseases. This is what the Europeans brought to the natives in the Americas. Okay? Coming back to this. So when the initial anthropologists, they started understanding these cultures, they had to understand these cultures. They did not go to these cultures. They did not go to these cultures or live with those cultures or observe these cultures directly. Some of them did not even know how do they actually look like or what practices do they do. They only relied on whatever information was sent to them by the administrators and the missionaries in their native countries. This secondary data was used by them for theorizing. And that's, as such, they have been branded as armchair experts. घर बैठ के armchair, जिस पे तुम बैठे हो भी, expert, यहां बैठ के तुमने पूरी थ्योरी लिख दी. Armchair expert. That you did not even go and bother about meeting those individuals. And you pass on a judgment. And this happens quite often with us also. We have never met a person from the other culture, but we still have a stereotype and judgment ready for that culture. Some of you might have not met any African till date, but you might have your own set of stereotypes and judgments for them. किसी दोस्त हैं कोई Africans? होंगे कुछ के, I'm not denying, but some people have not seen them. And still they have sets of judgments and stereotypes for them. Right? And if I ask people, they can go on writing about them. What exactly do they do? What are their practices? Why are they bad people? Why are they good people? Sab likh denge unko. Same thing was done by these thinkers. They sat back home, cozy environment, whatever data was sent, read that, arrange it, come out with certain laws, certain ideas about the social evolution, right? This approach was called as an armchair expert approach, right? Which relied on secondary data, which was not face-to-face first-hand information. This was then countered by later anthropologists. Later anthropologists, even Franz Boas countered this approach because he was a Stark. He was very, very much opposed to the evolutionist ideas, right? And the approach used by the evolutionists. Franz Boas, who is the famous American anthropologist, he was also opposed to these ideas. And he himself had taken a journey to the famous Baffin Islands in Pacific, in Atlantic. Baffin Islands. And he wanted to study those cultures. He took a ship journey, did a field work, stayed there. He also stayed there. Right? And then he tried to write about those cultures. So it was initiated by Franz Boas to some extent, this field work as a tradition. But Malinowski's work has been glorified because he had lived like a native. He had participated in their festivals, right? And wrote his field work in the native languages. He learned the native language first. He learned the native language first, and only then he recorded their practices to be able to better appreciate. For example, you all might have your own set of native languages. Most of the urbanized people do not have much ideas of native languages. But to understand your culture properly, if somebody learns the native language, only then the person can understand that culture. है कि नहीं? For example, most of the phrases or the things that we study in English, why is English so difficult to learn for Indians? Because the language is not just simple formula. It has developed in a cultural context, and that context we are not aware of. That context we are not aware of. So some of their proverbs are embedded in their cultural context, which we are unaware of. Agree or not? Of which we are unaware of. And it is really difficult to appreciate for us. What exactly are they referring to? Yes or no? That is why it becomes difficult. Why is it so easy for us to learn our native language? Because every experience that is being shared is known to us somewhere or the other. in some way or the other. Agree? So he did it in the native language of these people who lived in the Trobriand Islands. Malinowski. Franz Boas had started this tradition. The E.B. Tyler and L.H. Morgan did not even bother to do that. Evolutionists. Franz Boas at least got out of his home. Right? Got on a ship to go and learn about those cultures. And the whole point is when he went there, his own stereotypes were changed. His own stereotypes had changed about these natives, who are the Inuits in the northern islands, which are Atlantic islands, or the Arctic region. Some of these islands, which are closer to the Arctic, the people who are living in these snowy areas, they are now the term that is used for them is the Inuits. Right? So Franz Boas had conducted a fieldwork trip into this area. But later, Malinowski is credited with the longest fieldwork till date, one of the most important, the fieldwork that was done in the native language, right? And which gave us considerable information about the natives. Right? And from thereupon, this approach has become an inherent part of the way in which the other cultures need to be understood. For example, today you have to talk about the Indian villages. Indian village hai. Indian village is not just a space where people live. It is also a social phenomena. Right? To understand the Indian village, you cannot go on writing a commentary about the Indian village. If you are an anthropologist, you will have to go there, live there, learn about how the cultures, how the villages understand themselves, participate in those villages, and then write about those villages, whatever has been the observation. Right? This approach has been called as participant observation and the fieldwork tradition. Now, the whole point is anthropology has glorified Malinowski's work so much. Malinowski is the father of the fieldwork tradition, considered as a father. It's considered as the father of the participant observation as an approach. And his work has been glorified for the fieldwork as an idea. Malinowski's work is a very famous work. Everywhere you'll find Malinowski being present. Right? The UPSC this year asked the question, what were the criticisms of the Malinowski's fieldwork? What were the criticisms of the Malinowski's fieldwork? So that is why I'm saying, keep your eyes and ears open. Be curious about things. Right? The criticism was that his personal diary was found after his death. What he had published was only known in the public sphere. His personal diary that he wrote there, he had written a diary in which he noted everything about the native culture in which he lived, the Trobriand Islands. He also wrote a personal diary in which he wrote what is his feeling. And he had used so many terms which were actually ethnocentric, like Negroes for the natives, right? In which he vented out his hatred for the natives and all such problems he had talked about in his personal diary. So this over-glorification then was questioned later. So this was the question that was asked. Just giving you a glimpse how the things go about in the discipline. ठीक है? लिखो. As opposed to or even before this, write down, you can't do as opposed to, write down. The early evolutionists relied on secondary data which was provided to them to them by the colonial administrators, by the colonial administrators and missionaries, by the colonial administrators and the missionaries. Right? And they did not take any fieldwork trip to gather data about these so-called other cultures. Because of their reliance on secondary data, they were termed as armchair anthropologists. Armchair, हत्ते वाली कुर्सी. Armchair anthropologists by the later anthropologists. They were termed as armchair anthropologists by the later anthropologists. ठीक है? Who were these early evolutionists? E.V. Tyler, L.H. Morgan. लिख लो ब्रैकेट में. Edward Burnett Tyler, Lewis Henry Morgan, L.H. Morgan. ठीक है? Fair enough. Then write down as opposed to the early evolutionists. The later anthropologists like Franz Boas, W.H.R. Rivers. W.H.R. Rivers. He's a famous anthropologist who conducted the fieldwork in the Todas in 1906, right? As well as in the Andaman Islanders. He took a fieldwork there, right? W.H.R. Rivers and Malinowski, Brain's Law, Malinowski emphasized the fieldwork tradition. Fieldwork tradition. It refers to an approach of direct data collection by participating with the people who are the subject of study. Its emphasis is on physical presence of the anthropologists, physical presence of the anthropologists in the field. In the field. Then write down participant observation. छोटा सा बैठेंगे इसी के अंदर. Participant observation. It also involves going to the field and staying with the people who are the subject of study, But it also emphasizes on learning the native language, native language, underline this, learning the native language and observing the phenomena under study and observing the phenomena under study and recording them systematically and objectively analyzing them right? Write down examples first. कितने तुमको याद है? Franz Boas, write down. Franz Boas went for a fieldwork expedition to the Baffin Islands. Baffin Islands, Baffin. Baffin Islands to study the culture of Inuits. Inuits, in bracket you can write the so-called Eskimos. Inuits, in bracket write down Eskimos. But from now on, that is just for your understanding, the Eskimos, but what the term that we use is going to be Inuits only. Eskimo नहीं use करना है. ठीक है? Eskimo means raw meat eaters. तो गलत है वो. लिखो. To study the cultures of Inuits and was termed as the first systematic anthropological field work. ठीक है? Second, write down WHR Rivers. WHR Rivers wrote a monograph. Monograph is basically an ethnographic account, right? Wrote a monograph. The Todas, in quotes, 1906. And third, write down Malinowski. Third, write down Malinowski. Fieldwork he took was to which islands? Trobriand Islands. Trobriand Islands of Melanesia. Trobriand Islands of Melanesia. Trobriand Islands, or the natives are called as Trobriand Islanders. Trobriand Islands. These islands are basically a set of archipelago. क्या होता है archipelago? A
Island.
group of islands. कैसे बनता है? बहुत सारी theories हैं. Volcanic, geography में पढ़ते हैं. Archipelago, how it is formed. So it is an archipelago in the Central Pacific or Southern Pacific Ocean, right? Where the present Papua New Guinea is the country. So the name is on the basis of that visit. Papua New Guinea is now participating in the Cricket World Cup also. ठीक है ना? So write down Trobriand Islanders of Melanesia. That was his field work from 1915 to 1918. 1915 to 1918. He spent longer time than any other anthropologists. Before and after him. Before and after him. He was the first to conduct the study in the natives' language, which has been termed as the participant observation approach. Participant observation approach. And the account that he published was Argonauts of Western Pacific. Argonauts क्या होता है? People who go on risky expeditions, risky quests, adventures, right? Argonauts. So why were these termed as risky by him? Because they were taking risky rides under the Kula ring. They were taking risky journeys to the different islands under the Kula ring, which he saw as a economic phenomena in these Trobriand Islanders. Okay? Today we will stop here. Tomorrow we will start with the cross-cultural comparison. Have a glimpse of it. Okay, everybody go back, revise, because every day the knowledge will accumulate, like the culture has accumulated so much knowledge. Okay? See you tomorrow then.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Thank you, sir.
चेहरा दिखा. ऑनलाइन वालों से एक ही रिक्वेस्ट रहती है लास्ट तक कि चेहरा दिखा दो अपना. दिखा के चले मत जाया करो, चालू रखा करो एंड तक. ऐसी क्या चीजें जो मैं देख लूंगा यहाँ से? पीछे मैप लगा होगा, मैं देख लूंगा क्या हो गया इसमें. ठीक है?